Just a nurse. That's what Richard Donovan called her the day before everything changed. He didn't know Major Elena Martinez had held Bagram 8 Station for 16 hours under coordinated assault, treating 47 wounded with shrapnel lodged in her own shoulder. He didn't know the trembling hands restocking bandages at Fashion Valley Mall were the same hands that performed field thoracotomy with a combat knife when the surgical team was pinned down. He didn't know the woman in the blue scrubs had 3 combat Valor citations folded in a safety deposit box, or that the single dog tag beneath her shirt belonged to the man whose son she raised alone. What happened in the next 72 hours didn't just silence the room. It brought an institution to its knees. Elena Martinez bent toward the bottom shelf of her first aid station, and the familiar electric current shot through her left shoulder. The shrapnel scar, a constellation of old injuries mapped across her collarbone and deltoid, seized in the mall's aggressive air conditioning. She paused. Breathed through it. The fluorescent lights of Fashion Valley's food court hummed above her, that particular frequency that only appeared at precisely 4,000 kHz, the same pitch as the alert system at FOB Shank 12 years ago. She didn't flinch. 3 years of pushing that sensation into a locked room inside her chest had made her very good at not flinching. The bandage box was aluminum, probably 23 pounds, the kind that required lifting above shoulder height to reach the back of the cramped cabinet. Elena repositioned her stance, left leg forward, right leg anchored, distributing weight through her hips instead of her shoulder joint. Combat efficiency applied to retail medical supplies. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd commanded trauma response in active firefight with the same precision she now used to organize gauze in a mall. Muscle memory was a grenade that never stopped exploding. You need help with that. Marcus, the mall's head of security, stood 3 feet away. He'd been asking the same question for 3 years. She'd been refusing the same way for 3 years. Got it. Elena slid the box into place without touching the wound. The fluorescent lights caught the edge of her name tag, Elena, First Aid. No rank. No call sign. No indication that the woman arranging elastic bandages in color-coded order had once coordinated medical triage for 214 Marines across 47 square kilometers of contested territory. The name tag was exactly who she decided to be: invisible. She straightened, and her right hand found the outline of the dog tag beneath her scrubs. The chain was broken, snapped during David's last deployment, and the tag itself had been soldered back together. Marcus Webb, David's commanding officer, had pressed it into her son's hand the day David medically discharged. David had given it to her 2 weeks later, the night he couldn't sleep, and she'd worn it every day since, like a second heartbeat. The metal was warm now, having absorbed her body temperature. She pressed it once against her sternum and released. 3 years. That's how long Elena had been restocking bandages and applying ice packs to twisted ankles. 3 years since the VA had approved her medical discharge on grounds of service-related injury with limited functional restoration. 3 years of trying to be just a person. Just a mother. Just someone who worked a shift and went home to an apartment where the shadows didn't move like incoming rounds. The photo in her station's bottom drawer showed David in rock dress uniform, standing beside a man with a guide dog and the precise posture of someone who'd learned to navigate darkness with the same discipline he'd navigated Helmand Province. She kept the photo but covered the man's face with her thumb whenever the mall staff passed by. Some stories required institutional permission to tell, and Elena had learned the hard way that her story wasn't the kind that got permission. Richard Donovan swept past her station at 4:48 p.m., exactly as he did every afternoon. He moved through Fashion Valley Mall the way generals moved through secured territory, shoulders back, chin elevated, eyes cataloging every detail of his domain as if his noticing made it real. 15 years climbing the hierarchy. 15 years transforming a mid-tier retail job into something that required a corner office and a leather chair that cost more than Elena's monthly rent. He wore a suit that probably cost $800, the kind of fabric that whispered when he moved. He didn't acknowledge her. Donovan acknowledged the mall like it was an extension of his body. The people in it registered only as moving obstacles. Afternoon, Elena, he called to someone behind her. Not to her. Past her. The distinction was everything. Elena continued organizing supplies. A box of latex-free gloves. 2 cases of saline solution. 4 bottles of hydrogen peroxide with the seal still intact. She moved each item to its precise location, the shelf and inventory system so organized it bordered on mathematical. In the army, they called that kind of precision combat ready. In civilian life, people called it excessive. She preferred not to think about which was true anymore. The mall sound system shifted. A new playlist started. Something with violins and synthesizers, designed to encourage shopping without creating urgency. Elena had learned the mall's acoustic landscape the way she'd learned the sound signatures of incoming mortar fire. She could identify the opening of the Apple Store by the slight change in echo when their glass doors cycled. She could hear when the food court hit maximum capacity because the crowd noise shifted from individual conversations to white noise, a frequency that rose to approximately 87 decibels. At 5:12 p.m., the white noise changed texture. New sound entered the system. Laughter, the kind that didn't belong at Fashion Valley. Not the warm laughter of families or teenagers genuinely enjoying each other's company. This was the laughter of mockery. Sharp-edged. Coordinated. The kind of laughter Elena recognized from high school hallways and now, apparently, from shopping malls on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. She continued organizing bandages. The laughter continued. It seemed to originate from near the Apple Store, maybe 30 meters from her station, close enough to hear individual words now. Elena didn't turn around. Turning around would acknowledge that she'd noticed. Noticing things was how you invited scrutiny. But the sound pulled at something in her chest. Not fear. Elena had burnt through her capacity for fear in places where fear was accurate. This was something else. Recognition. The acoustic signature of cruelty. She'd heard it in convoy radio chatter from units that didn't follow rules of engagement. She'd heard it in field hospital tents when junior enlisted made jokes about casualties from friendly fire. She'd heard it in her own apartment when David came home from his deployment with eyes that wouldn't focus on the present moment. Elena touched the dog tag again. Subconscious. Reflexive. The way people touched crosses or amulets. The metal was still warm. Still there. Still carrying whatever story it held from the day Marcus Webb had pressed it into her son's hand and told him to come home. The laughter intensified. Someone shouted something. Elena didn't catch the words, but she caught the shape of them. Mockery. Cruelty directed at someone specific. Someone who couldn't see it coming. Her hand stilled on the medical supplies. The clock read 5:14 p.m. In 3 hours, Elena's shift ended. In 3 hours, she would drive home in her decade-old Honda Civic and make dinner for David and grade the latest round of papers from her night college classes. She had exactly 118 days until she finished her associate's degree in nursing administration. 118 days of keeping her head down, her voice quiet, her history buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it was there. Behind her, at the Apple Store, someone cried out. Not a laugh. A sound closer to humiliation. Elena turned around. A sound closer to humiliation. Elena turned around. Near the Apple Store, 4 teenagers surrounded a man with a white cane. His service dog, a German shepherd with a burgundy harness, stood rigid, reading the tension the way dogs always do. The man's sightless eyes faced forward, but his jaw was clenched tight as a fist. Dude's doing the zombie walk, one teen said, mimicking the cane sweep across the polished floor. Another laughed. Bet he's faking for sympathy cash. They were filming on their phones. For phones. For angles. For futures where this moment would live forever on the internet, packaged as entertainment for strangers. Elena knew that sound. She'd heard it in Kandahar when locals mocked a Marine missing his legs. She'd heard it in field hospitals when the wounded were too broken to fight back. The sound of people tasting cruelty and finding it sweet. She moved without deciding to move. Her legs carried her across the food court, past the pretzel stand, into the periphery of the teenager circle. Her voice was quiet. "He's a veteran. Show some respect." The laughter didn't stop. It amplified. "What are you, the mall cop?" The girl closest to Elena had manicured nails the color of fresh blood. "Go back to putting band-aids on paper cuts, nurse nobody." Elena's hand found the dog tag beneath her scrubs, cold metal, broken chain. She could see his face now. The bearing. The way he stood despite the blindness, spine straight as a 2x4, shoulders back despite for cameras trained on his humiliation. She knew that posture. She'd taught soldiers that posture. Marcus Webb. David's commanding officer. The man who saved her son's life in the Loga province and lost his sight doing it. But she said nothing about that. "You need to leave," Elena told the teenagers. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not loud. Just lower. The kind of lower that made people's nervous systems register danger. Now. They didn't move. The service dog's ears flattened. Animals know when humans decide to fight. That's when Richard Donovan emerged from the mall's administrative corridor, summoned by the teenagers' parents who were already on their phones, already speaking in the language of lawyers and donations and liability. Donovan was the mall's assistant general manager, pressed suit, polished shoes, the kind of posture that came from 15 years of climbing institutional ladders. He took in the scene in a single sweep, for teenagers looking innocent, one blind man standing silently, and Elena in her scrubs with her hand on her chest. Donovan didn't ask what happened. He addressed the growing crowd of shoppers raising their phones. "This employee has abandoned her post and is harassing our valued customers." His voice was loud enough to carry across the food court. "Return to your station immediately." Elena stepped forward. Those teenagers were mocking him. Recording it for social media. "I don't need excuses from someone who stocks band-aids for minimum wage." Donovan's smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. "These families donate to our ownership group's foundation. You don't get to lecture them." He pulled out his tablet. His fingers moved across the screen with the precision of someone weaponizing technology. "I'm writing you up right here, right now, so everyone can see what happens when staff forget their place." His voice had the texture of someone used to being obeyed. The crowd's phones rotated toward him like flowers following the sun. Abandonment of duty. Harassment of customers. Insubordination. Elena's jaw clenched. Not from anger. From something deeper. From the weight of 3 years spent burying who she was, and 30 seconds of watching it matter to absolutely no one. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from training. From trauma bays under mortar fire. From holding pressure on wounds in the dark and trusting your hands to remember what your mind was too tired to hold. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Donovan. "That man earned his blindness at Bagram," she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser, "which is more than you've earned anything in your life." The food court went silent. The kind of silent where fluorescent lights become deafening. Where phone cameras keep filming because this was the moment. This was the thing that would go viral. Not the teenagers mocking a blind veteran. This. The nurse talking back. Donovan's face turned the color of spoiled meat. His fingers flew across his tablet. "Security. Escort this employee back to her station. Now." 2 security guards approached, both of them regular visitors to Elena's first aid station for bandages and blood pressure checks and the kind of small talk that made them human instead of uniforms. They looked uncomfortable. They looked sorry. They did it anyway. Elena gathered her personal belongings from behind the counter while shoppers stared. Her co-workers, the other 2 medical staff who'd been chatting by the supply closet, stood and left without a word. Their phones were already showing the video. Already showing her speaking out of turn, challenging a superior, breaking the invisible contract that kept people like her invisible. Donovan followed her to the station and posted the write-up on the bulletin board where anyone walking past could see it. The magnets caught and held. The letters were large enough to read from the escalators. His voice was loud enough for the entire food court to hear. "Let this remind you," he said, his tone the color of contempt, "that hierarchy exists for a reason. You're here to serve, not to play hero." He turned to leave, then added over his shoulder with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, "And Saint Nobody. That's your new name. The nurse who thinks she's special." Marcus Webb stood nearby, his service dog alert, sensitive to the electrical charge running through the space where Elena stood. He stepped forward slightly. "If there's anything." Elena shook her head. She couldn't speak. Couldn't tell him that she knew exactly who he was and what he'd done for David. That the dog tag beneath her shirt carried his name. That she'd held onto it for 3 years like it was the only real thing left of her son's life before he came home broken and trying to smile. 30 minutes later, Elena was gathering the last of her personal belongings from the first aid station: a sweater, a phone charger, a bottle of ibuprofen she kept for the muscle memory aches in her shoulder. The write-up was still pinned to the board. Donovan had done good work. Very thorough work. Very documented work. That's when screaming erupted from the Nordstrom entrance. A crowd formed. Elena heard the sound before she saw it, the particular quality of panic that comes with cardiac events. A man, elderly, collapsed on the polished floor, clutching his chest. His lips were already taking on the blue-gray color of someone whose oxygen supply was running backward. Elena's combat instincts moved faster than thought. She pushed through the crowd, her knees hitting the tile floor hard enough to leave marks. No hesitation. No awareness of the cameras, the write-up, the humiliation still echoing through the mall. Just muscle memory older than her civilian life and hands that remembered field hospitals in Loga province. She checked for a pulse. Tilted his head. Started compressions with the rhythm she drilled 1,000 times, 110 beats per minute, ribs cracking under her palms the way they had to crack to save a life. "Someone call 911 now," she commanded without looking up. Her voice had dropped into the register of battlefield authority. "You, get the AED from the Mace's customer service desk. You, clear this space. Move." The crowd obeyed. People recognized command when they heard it. She delivered rescue breaths, returning to compressions. Her shoulder screamed, the old shrapnel wound from Bagram, the one that made lifting her left arm feel like pushing through broken glass. But pain was just information. Pain meant she was still functional. The AED arrived. Elena applied the pads with practiced efficiency. "Clear," she called, and the machine delivered its shock. The man's body convulsed. His eyes flickered open. His lips gasped for air. Paramedics arrived for minutes later, and Elena gave them the crisp, detailed report she'd been trained to deliver. 72-year-old male, witnessed cardiac arrest approximately 4 minutes ago, continuous CPR, 1 AED shock delivered, return of spontaneous circulation achieved 90 seconds post-shock. No known medical history available on scene. The lead paramedic looked at her with the kind of respect that only exists between people who'd trained in the same language. "You kept him alive. Good work." But Donovan was already positioning himself between Elena and the paramedics. Already pulling out his phone. Already calculating the liability exposure of a written-up employee performing emergency medicine in front of 24 witnesses and their phones. 30 minutes. That's how long it took for the adrenaline to burn away and reality to arrive in the form of security personnel standing near the first aid station, watching her collect the items from her locker with the focused precision of someone operating on muscle memory. Elena's hands moved through the motions: water bottle, phone charger, the small framed photo of David in his dress blues, each object placed into her canvas bag with deliberate care. The write-up from Donovan was still pinned to the bulletin board behind her, the tablet printout already laminated and dated with cold administrative efficiency: employee conduct investigation. Unauthorized medical intervention. Liability exposure. She didn't read it twice. She didn't need to. The security guard, a man whose name tag read Martinez but whose eyes held zero recognition, stood exactly 6 feet away. Not threatening. Not yet. Just present. Waiting. Elena had seen this posture before in Afghanistan, soldiers maintaining a perimeter without confrontation. Professional distance. She respected it even as she despised everything it represented. The guard shifted his weight. She could hear the leather of his duty belt creak, the soft static of his radio buzzing with mall traffic calls that had nothing to do with her anymore. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their endless mechanical song, indifferent to the career ending beneath them. She zipped the bag. One motion. Clean. Done. That's when the screaming started. Not the ordinary mall noise of shoppers and ambient chaos. This was different. This was primal. This was the sound of someone's body betraying them in public, the specific pitch of terror mixed with the gasping inhalation of someone who couldn't quite catch their breath. It erupted from somewhere near the Nordstrom entrance, maybe 200 feet away, echoing off the marble floors in a way that made other shoppers stop mid-stride. Elena's body recognized it before her mind did. The scream activated something ancient in her nervous system, the same neural pathway that had snapped her awake on cots in forward operating bases, the same instinct that had sent her moving toward explosions instead of away from them. "Stay here," the security guard said. He was already moving. Elena watched him jog toward the escalators. Other mall staff converged from different directions, their confusion visible in the hesitation of their movements. She stood alone at the first aid station, her canvas bag resting against her leg, and made a choice she hadn't known she was making. She moved. The crowd near Nordstrom had already begun its transformation from shoppers to witnesses. Phones were rising. Videos were starting. She could see the small red recording lights before she could see what lay at the center of the growing circle. An elderly man was on the marble floor. His face had the peculiar grayish pallor she had learned to recognize in field conditions, not from textbooks but from holding a field hospital together for 16 hours while mortars fell outside the perimeter. His chest wasn't rising properly. His left arm was positioned across his body in the way that bodies sometimes positioned themselves when the cardiac system was staging a catastrophic failure. Elena moved through the crowd like water finding a path. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. She was already kneeling beside him when she registered that his name tag read Harold and that he worked at the Nordstrom jewelry counter and that his eyes were open and aware and terrified. His mouth was opening and closing. No words. Just the sound of air struggling to move against a system that was no longer cooperating with his brain's demands. "I'm a nurse," Elena said. Her voice had already dropped an octave, already shifted into the register of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need space. Now." People actually moved. Years of studying the human psyche wouldn't explain it, but Elena understood it perfectly. It was the voice of someone who had given orders under fire, and people's primitive brains recognized authority when it spoke with that particular timbre. She positioned him supine. His jaw was clenched. She opened the airway with a head tilt, checking for obstruction, finding none, and immediately began chest compressions at a rate her muscle memory calculated without consultation, 100 beats per minute. The rhythm burned into her bones from 12 years of trauma protocols across 2 different continents. "Call 911, she said to a woman holding a phone. "Tell them cardiac arrest. Adult male, apparent age 75 to 80. We're in Fashion Valley Mall, Nordstrom entrance, north side." Her hands were already moving through the compressions with the fluid precision of apex predators, all wasted motion eliminated by years of practice. Hands steady as surgical lasers. Push. Release. Push. Release. The rhythm was prayer and science combined, the ancient rhythm of blood being forced through vessels by external force because the organ had betrayed its fundamental contract. She could feel his ribs yielding slightly under her palms, could feel the slight give of his sternum against the heel of her hand, could feel the body beginning to respond to the rhythm even as she calculated the countdown. Every minute without a perfusing rhythm was 3 minutes of brain cell death, every second mattered with the weight of permanence. People were backing away now, their phone cameras elevated. She could see Donovan at the periphery of her vision, standing near the Apple Store entrance, his expression shifting from initial shock to something else. Something calculating. His hand was already moving toward his pocket. Already reaching for his phone. Already converting this moment from a human crisis into an institutional liability assessment. Elena didn't stop compressions. She had learned long ago to work in her tunnel, to let the outside world collapse into irrelevance. Compression. Release. Compression. Release. The rhythm was all that existed. The man's pupils were already dilating, the golden hour of cardiac resuscitation already ticking forward, but his body was still warm and still within the window where electricity and chemistry might convince his heart to remember its job. "Has anyone grabbed the AED?" she called. "We have one at the station," a younger man said. He was already running. Donovan's hand was out of his pocket now. The phone was at his ear. Elena watched him in the peripheral edges of her awareness, the way he was speaking quietly but intensely, the way his eyes were moving across the crowd of recording phones, the way his jaw was clenching with the particular strain of someone performing rapid mental calculus. She knew exactly what he was seeing: liability. Exposure. Risk. An unauthorized medical intervention unfolding in real time in front of 24 camera phones that would upload those videos to the internet before the ambulance even arrived, permanent digital records of the mall's emergency response infrastructure failing and having to be rescued by a written-up former employee. The AED arrived. Elena didn't break rhythm. "Pad placement," she said. The young man was already tearing open the electrode packaging with shaking hands. Elena lifted her body weight off Harold's chest long enough for the pads to be placed, one below the right clavicle, one below the left breast, and then she resumed compressions as the device powered on. The electronic voice was eerily calm. Analyzing rhythm. "Do not touch patient." She lifted her hands. The machine's analysis lasted 3 seconds that stretched like hours. Then, shock advised. "Stand clear." The sound when it delivered was like a lightning strike contained in a small plastic box, Harold's body convulsing involuntarily, electricity reminding his heart what it was supposed to be doing. Elena waited the prescribed seconds and then resumed compressions without waiting for instruction. Compress. Release. Compress. Release. Her shoulders were already beginning to burn, cardiac resuscitation was brutally taxing on muscles, but her face remained composed, her breathing steady, her movements economical. She was operating in that space beyond pain, beyond fatigue, beyond the knowledge of what was happening at the periphery of the scene. That's when she heard Donovan's voice. Not shouting. Not confrontational. Just quiet. Just urgent. He was on his phone, his voice the kind of controlled intensity that came from someone accustomed to wielding institutional power. "Get security to the Nordstrom entrance. Now. The nurse they just wrote up is performing emergency medical intervention. Document everything. I need her off that patient the moment the paramedics arrive." A pause. Elena's compressions didn't falter. "Yes, I know he's saving his life. That's the problem. Unauthorized practice. Liability. We need to establish grounds for immediate termination." Elena's hands kept moving. Compress. Release. Compress. Release. She could hear sirens already beginning their approach, the sound growing louder, the electronic wall of institutional emergency response finally beginning to arrive. She could hear Donovan making a second call, this one higher up the chain. Corporate counsel? Richard Donovan, Assistant General Manager, Fashion Valley. "We have a situation. I'm documenting an employee performing an authorized medical intervention in our facility. I need legal guidance on exposure and termination protocols before the paramedics finish transport." Her eyes never left Harold's face. His pupils were still dilated. His color was still poor. But his chest was rising and falling with the rhythm of her compressions, and that was enough. That was everything. She could feel the faintest flutter of pulse at his neck when she pressed her fingers there during compressions, not strong, but present, his heart beginning to remember its purpose. The paramedics arrived in a wash of professional competence. Two of them, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who spent their days pulling bodies back from the edge. Elena immediately transitioned her patient report as the senior paramedic knelt beside her. "Down approximately 4 minutes before I initiated compressions," Elena said. Initial rhythm was apparent cardiac arrest. One shock advised by AED, post-shock compressions continuous. Current rate 100 compressions per minute. Last pulse check, carotid pressure approximately 40. He's responding. The paramedic nodded once, the brief acknowledgement of one trained person recognizing another, and they began the coordinated dance of transferring care. Their equipment was more sophisticated, their systems more capable. They moved like they trusted her assessment. Like she was someone worth listening to. That's when Donovan appeared beside the paramedic stretcher with the head of mall security, a man Elena recognized but whose name she had never learned. Donovan was speaking quietly to the security director, but his words were pitched to Carrie. "Delete her access immediately. While she's still here. I want that badge deactivated before she leaves the property." The security director hesitated. Elena could see the moment of internal conflict pass across his face, the tension between institutional authority and basic human decency. She watched him lose. Watched him pull out a radio and make the call, "Central, this is operations. Cancel building access for Elena Martinez, badge number 447. Effective immediately. Yes, now." The radio crackled acknowledgement. Donovan's phone was at his ear again. Elena could hear him speaking to someone at the staffing agency that had placed her, the conversation coming through in fragments between his words to the paramedics and security. "Liability risk, unauthorized provision of care, we cannot maintain her placement at this facility or any of our partner locations." The paramedics were loading Harold onto the stretcher now, his body already beginning the transition from her hands to the hospital system. She stepped back, her legs already beginning to register the effort of sustained cardiac compressions. She could feel a tremor starting to build in her hands, not fear, not weakness, just the physiological response of muscles pushed beyond their design parameters. She pressed her hand into the pockets of her scrubs to hide it. Marcus Webb's voice came from somewhere in the crowd, calling out, "Please," but Elena couldn't face him. Couldn't let him see what was already beginning to fracture at the edges of her composure. She turned away and began walking toward the parking garage as Donovan made his third call, this one to someone at the corporate level. She could hear him invoking words like liability and investigation and need her personnel file documented. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text message from the staffing agency, "We need to discuss your contract status immediately. Please call." Elena kept walking. The fluorescent lights of the mall corridor stretched in front of her like a runway to nowhere, the hum of the building's climate control system the only sound that seemed real anymore. 30 minutes had passed since Donovan ordered her from the premises. Now, having just saved a man's life on that same premises, she was officially erased from it. She didn't realize her hands were shaking until she reached her car. The parking garage smelled like hot asphalt and motor oil, the kind of smell that made her think of convoy route she'd rather forget. Elena's decade-old Honda Civic sat in space 347, 2 levels below the mall's main corridor, fluorescent lights flickering above like dying stars. She slid into the driver's seat and closed the door behind her, the metal frame groaning under the weight of the day she'd just lived. The silence was absolute. She reached for the ignition, turned the key. Click. Nothing. Again. Click. Click. Nothing. The battery was dead, completely dead, drained from the phone charger she'd left plugged into the dashboard outlet during her entire shift. 6 hours. The charger had been running the whole time. She tried once more, her right hand gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles bleached white. The engine didn't even attempt to turn over. It was as if the car understood that she didn't deserve to leave. Elena rested her forehead against the steering wheel. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash, the kind that hits a soldier the moment the mission ends and the body realizes it can finally stop fighting. Her left shoulder was seizing up, the old shrapnel wound tightening across her scapula like someone had wrapped a steel cable around the bone and was slowly, methodically twisting it. She tried to lift her arms to reach for her phone on the passenger seat. They wouldn't move. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The physical weight of the day had settled into her muscles like concrete drying. 20 minutes ago, she'd been erased from the mall system entirely. Her badge access deleted. Her employment file flagged. Her name sent to every staffing agency across San Diego County with a single notation: do not rehire. Richard Donovan had made 3 phone calls from his office while watching security footage of her saving a man's life. 3 calls. That's all it took to dismantle 3 years of carefully constructed normalcy. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt heavier than it ever had. She pressed her forehead harder against the steering wheel and let herself feel the weight of it, the single piece of metal on a broken silver chain, hanging just above her heart. Marcus Webb had given that tag to David when her son deployed to Afghanistan as a forward observer with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Marcus had been David's commanding officer, a SEAL Team 3 veteran reassigned to mentor junior enlisted men. The tag had been Marcus's talisman, something he'd carried through 2 combat deployments and countless operations she'd never been cleared to hear about. He'd pressed it into David's hand the day David's unit shipped out to Helmand Province and said, "So you remember someone's got your back." 6 months later, a roadside IED detonated near Marcus's Humvee. He survived. The blast took his sight instantly, retinas burned by the flash, optic nerve severed by the pressure wave. He'd spent 3 weeks at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center and then transferred to Walter Reed for reconstruction surgery that didn't work. Marcus had given the tag back to David when David came home on emergency leave to see him. David had been 18 years old, still wearing his marine dress blues, and he'd pressed that tag into Elena's hand in their kitchen and said, "Mom, you need to know why this matters." She'd worn it ever since. Hidden. Always hidden. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, an electrical sound like insects dying inside the fixtures. Elena's phone buzzed on the passenger seat. David! He was calling her again. That was the 7th time in 12 minutes. She couldn't answer. Her hands wouldn't obey the command. It was like something had severed the connection between her brain and her body, the same way that blast had severed the connection between Marcus Webb's eyes and his world. 3 years. She'd been rebuilding her life for 3 years. 3 years of waking up before dawn and running 5 miles to tire out the hypervigilance. 3 years of working first aid at the mall instead of working trauma at Mercy General, where they'd offered her a full-time position, a position that would require background checks that might lead to questions about why a decorated combat medical officer was suddenly available for civilian work. 3 years of being David's mom, just David's mom, nobody else, nothing else, nobody important. Just a woman in scrubs who knew how to stop bleeding and restart hearts. Just a woman who didn't exist before 2022. She tried to lift her head from the steering wheel. The muscle coordination wasn't there. Pain is information, she used to tell the corpsmen under her command at Bagram Air Station. Pain tells you where the damage is. Right now, the pain was telling her that every single ounce of strength she had, physical, professional, emotional, had been used up in that cardiac arrest scene, and there was nothing left. No reserves. No fallback position. The adrenaline was gone and the crash was total. The man she'd saved was probably in the ICU by now, talking to his daughter, thanking God or his doctor or the universe for giving him another day. He'd never know that the woman who'd saved him was currently locked in a parking garage, unable to dial 911, unable to call her son, unable to move. The phone buzzed again. This time a text message notification. She could see the screen from where her forehead pressed against the wheel. The illumination cast a pale blue glow across the dashboard. It was David. "Mom, where are you? Work said you left. Didn't you get my calls? I need to tell you something." She couldn't answer him either. The weight of the dog tag seemed to shift then, or maybe she just became aware of it for the first time in hours. It pressed against her chest like a small fist. Marcus Webb. Blind. Still alive because of decisions Elena had made while shrapnel was embedding itself in her own shoulder. David, 17 years old and coming home from rock drills in his uniform, probably still wearing the dress blues. His commanding officers said he had his mother's precision, his mother's ability to think clearly under pressure. Nobody at his school knew his mother had spent 16 hours performing emergency surgery in a mud-walled aid station while Taliban mortars walked rounds across the compound. Nobody knew his mother had used a surgical stapler to close a wound because they were out of sutures. Nobody knew his mother had held a 19-year-old Marine's hand while he died because they didn't have the blood type he needed. Nobody knew. And then they found out. Today. When a mall security manager with a $400 tablet decided he didn't like the look in a decorated veteran's eyes. Elena's hands finally moved, not because she commanded them to, but because her body had decided that immobility was no longer sustainable. She reached for the ignition again, knowing it wouldn't work but unable to stop herself from trying. Click! 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 The car's battery was as dead as her professional reputation. She pressed the unlock button and pushed the door open. The humidity from the parking garage rushed in, carrying the smell of concrete dust and old motor oil and something metallic, rain coming, probably. A storm front moving in from the Pacific. The weatherman had predicted it 3 days ago. She'd watched the forecast on her phone while drinking coffee at 5 a.m., the way she did every morning, the way thousands of nurses did every morning, the way nobody famous did, because nobody famous worked first aid at shopping malls. Elena stepped out of the car and closed the door behind her. The parking garage was almost empty at 4:36 p.m. on a Wednesday. 3 other vehicles spread across the visible section, their owners probably still at the mall, probably still shopping, probably still existing in a world where losing your job didn't mean losing the only life structure you'd managed to build. She looked back at the Honda Civic, old, unreliable and currently as useless as she felt. The security camera mounted on the pillar 12 feet away would have captured everything, her arriving, her slumped posture against the steering wheel, her moment of complete surrender. That camera would have a timestamp. That footage would exist somewhere in the mall server. She made a note of that fact without feeling anything about it. The capacity for caring had been depleted. Her phone was still buzzing. She pulled it from her pocket and looked at the screen. 9 missed calls. 17 text messages. All from David. The most recent one read, "Mom, please, I'm coming to find you. Something's happening at the mall. Something big." She didn't call back. She just stood in the parking garage and held the phone, feeling its slight vibration against her palm, and waited for something to change. Waited for the car to start. Waited for her shoulder to stop screaming. Waited for the man she'd saved to send a thank you note that would somehow undo the last 8 hours. Waited for Richard Donovan to realize he'd made a mistake. Waited for the dog tag under her scrubs to stop weighing like an anchor. Behind her, on the mall level above, events were already in motion that she couldn't see. The IT specialist named Jake Morrison, an Army veteran with 2 tours in Afghanistan, was copying security footage to an encrypted drive. Catherine Chen from the San Diego VA was being called by Marcus Webb, who'd been given Elena's phone number weeks ago and had it programmed into his smartphone. David Martinez was checking his mother's employee file on his school laptop, trying to understand why her work profile said terminated when she'd texted him that morning saying she had an easy shift ahead. And in Richard Donovan's office, he was making his 4th call of the day, his voice smooth and professional, explaining to a board member how the situation needed to be handled, how certain videos needed to be archived, how certain people needed to understand the hierarchy of a shopping mall. He didn't know any of them were listening. He didn't know what was coming. None of them did. David Martinez pushed through the mall's main corridor with his shoulders back and his jaw set like a man who had spent 17 years learning how to carry weight that wasn't physical. The shadow box was pressed against his chest, leather-bound, glass-fronted, holding medals and ribbons that caught the fluorescent light like captured stars. He didn't know where his mother's car was parked. He didn't know she was still trapped 3 levels below him in a dead Honda with her forehead against the steering wheel. What he knew was that his mother hadn't answered her phone in 40 minutes, and what he knew was the voice on the other end when Marcus Webb called him. The blind veteran had given him one address and one name. The voice in that name had been something David hadn't heard before, not pity, not anger, but the sound of a man who understood the specific weight of institutional cruelty. David's boot struck the tile in rhythm with his heartbeat as he climbed toward the administrative offices. 50 meters away. 40. He could feel the attention of security, the heads turning as he moved past the Apple store, past the teenagers who were probably still laughing somewhere about the man they'd mocked. He didn't stop. He didn't slow. The elevator rose to the 3rd floor, and when the doors opened, Richard Donovan's office was 30 feet straight ahead. The door was closed. David pushed it open without knocking. Donovan looked up from his desk, immaculate suit, gold cufflinks, the kind of man who had convinced himself that titles were the same as honor. His eyes registered David's Rotk uniform first, then the shadow box, then the expression on the young man's face that looked exactly like someone else's composure, held in the same places, released in the same measured way. David's voice didn't shake. It didn't crack. It filled the office and moved through the open doorway into the corridor where at least 6 people could hear it clearly. You fired Major Elena Martinez. And you need to see these. He opened the shadow box. The medals caught the light. Donovan's mouth opened. Closed. I don't know what you're talking about. That woman abandoned her post. He didn't finish. The elevator doors chimed from down the corridor, and 3 figures emerged into the administrative hallway with the kind of precision that made security cameras stop recording and custodians suddenly find other floors very urgent. The first was Marcus Webb, guided by his service dog, a black Labrador with a vest that read Certified Service Animal in white lettering. The second was a woman in her 60s with a VA credential on a lanyard and trembling hands that held a manila folder. The third was a man whose shoulders seemed to contain their own weather system, whose bearing suggested that at some point in his life, he had given orders that made people move before he finished speaking. The woman's voice came first. She introduced herself as Patricia Chen, Veteran Services Coordinator, VA San Diego, and what she said next made Donovan's face begin a very specific kind of pale that looked like all his blood was remembering somewhere else it needed to be. Elena Martinez's service file. 16 months embedded with the 5th Special Forces Group at Bagram. 3 combat valor citations. She held the aid station during a coordinated assault for 16 hours under fire. Treated 47 wounded with no backup and no way out. Marcus stepped forward. The service dog moved with him like they were the same organism operating on one nervous system. When Marcus spoke, his voice was the sound of a man looking directly at Donovan even though he couldn't see him, the kind of attention that sees everything. That woman held Bagram aid station against a coordinated assault for 16 hours. Personally treated 47 wounded. And when she got shrapnel in her shoulder from the mortar round that took my eyes, she finished stabilizing the patient before she let anyone touch her own wound. She didn't even tell me what happened until 3 days later. The third figure stepped into the office. His name tag read Colonel James Mercer, retired, corporate security oversight. When he spoke, his voice was calibrated at the exact frequency that made executive office chairs feel significantly smaller. A retired SEAL team leader witnessed your staff interaction on social media and arrived at this mall 37 minutes ago. He wants to walk you through Elena Martinez's actual decorations. He's in the security office. But first, let me be very clear about something. Donovan sat down. His hands had begun to shake. Mercer laid a tablet on the desk. Your building access logs show you called for security footage to be archived for legal review at 2:17 p.m. today. Our IT specialist, Jake Morrison, former Army, by the way, recovered the footage you requested be deleted. He has the time-stamped emails. He has your specific language requesting the removal of footage from the Apple Store incident and the cardiac emergency response. Another image appeared on the tablet screen. Elena, with her hands on a man's chest. Her mouth moving through rescue breaths. Her voice calling out compressions. 16 compressions. 30 compressions. The footage was so clear Donovan could see her hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this not in a training scenario but in conditions that involved actual mortality pressing down from above. "You pulled an active rescue response to file a complaint," Mercer said. "You called 3 institutions while she was still within auditory range, blacklisting her from employment in this county. And you attempted to delete the only documentation of your misconduct. That's not policy enforcement, Mr. Donovan. That's institutional malice with a paper trail." The woman from the VA was still reading from the file. Purple Heart. Meritorious Service Medal. Combat Medical Badge. Bronze Star with Valor. She paused. Each decoration had its own weight, its own silence. Her last note in the file says she took a medical discharge due to shoulder trauma and requested placement in civilian positions with minimal visibility. She requested anonymity. She requested no recognition. She requested to simply be a mother and a nurse. David was still holding the shadow box. The medals inside it were catching light and throwing it back at Donovan like accusations made of metal. The SEAL team leader arrived through the side entrance, a man whose face carried the kind of experience that made the room's institutional power structures suddenly look very fragile and very stupid. His voice was quiet. That was worse than if he had shouted. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. Purple Heart, twice. Meritorious Service Medal. Combat Medical Badge. Each one was spoken like a name being read at a funeral. She's quiet about it. That's the problem with real warriors. They don't announce themselves at parties. They just save the people in front of them and go back to work. The SEAL's hands were at his sides, but somehow his presence had moved everyone except David and Marcus Webb several inches backward. There was a teenage boy, the SEAL continued, in a supply closet at Bagram who had shrapnel in his femoral artery that was 50-50 on whether it would move and kill him if we even touched him. Elena Martinez decided to attempt a field thoracotomy with a combat knife to access the artery laterally instead of through conventional routes. While the base was being attacked. That boy is alive because she made a decision that had a very real chance of killing them both. Donovan's hands were no longer shaking. They had moved past shaking into a kind of stillness that suggested his nervous system had given up delivering messages to his extremities. Jake Morrison, the IT specialist, walked in carrying a laptop that was somehow more threatening than if he had been carrying a rifle. He set it on the desk and opened it to a file structure that made Donovan's eyes do something involuntary. "I'm Army. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 2014 to 2018, Morrison said, not to Donovan but to the room in general, establishing his credentials like someone laying out playing cards. "And I recovered every frame of footage you requested be deleted. I have your email chain with facilities. I have your phone records showing calls to the staffing agency at 2:34 p.m., 2:41 p.m., and 3:06 p.m. I have the staffing agency's response email confirming that based on your account, they would be pursuing disciplinary action for unauthorized medical intervention. I have all of it. Timestamped. Documented. Institutional evidence that you systematically destroyed someone's livelihood because she intervened in a situation where you had decided not to." The video played. Teenagers mocking a blind man. Donovan's face arriving, already made up in the configuration of someone who had decided whose side he was on before he understood the situation. Elena's voice, calm and precise. Donovan's response, his finger moving across the tablet even as the crowd grew, his mouth moving in what was clearly instructions to someone on a phone. Then the CPR footage. Elena's hands moving. Her voice counting. Her entire body committed to the single action of keeping a stranger alive while Donovan watched from approximately 8 feet away, already documenting his removal of her from the premises. "You have 48 hours, Colonel Mercer said, and this was when his voice dropped into the register that suggested someone very important had made a very final decision. You can resign from your position, request a severance package, and attempt to disappear into a different institution. Or we can proceed with the formal investigation, which will include interviews with the teenage defendants, their parents, multiple mall patrons, medical personnel, and a very detailed analysis of how you weaponized your position against a decorated military veteran. The staffing agency is already being contacted by legal counsel regarding the blacklisting. The teenagers' parents are currently reviewing their children's conduct. And your board connections have been informed that corporate is distancing itself from your employment record. David closed the shadow box. The sound of glass and leather ceiling was somehow the quietest thing that had happened in the room, and it was the most devastating. My mother, David said, served her country. Held a position under fire that most people would never be asked to hold. Got shrapnel. Kept working. And you fired her for saving a life because you had decided she was inconvenient. Donovan stood up. Sat back down. Stood up again. His office suddenly felt smaller. The windows that had once looked out over his institutional domain now seemed like they were showing him a world he was no longer part of. I want to know, the SEAL said quietly, why you chose to interpret her actions as a threat instead of as heroism. I want to understand the specific moment when you decided that policy mattered more than people. Because in my experience, that moment tells you something very important about a person. Donovan didn't answer. There was no answer that wouldn't sound like institutional cowardice wearing a suit. The corridor outside filled with the sound of institutional machinery turning. The general manager arrived, reviewing Donovan's personnel file with a facial expression that suggested this wasn't his first discovery of systematic misconduct. 3 previous complaints. All buried. All from employees with no leverage, no family, no one to fight back. 48 hours became 36 hours became the moment Richard Donovan walked out of Fashion Valley Mall in civilian clothes, his parking pass revoked, his access codes deleted, his professional references now actively discouraging any potential employer from hiring him. The institutional mechanisms he had spent 15 years climbing were still standing. They just didn't have a place for him in them anymore. 6 months passed like a calendar turning. Elena Martinez sat at a desk in the main concourse of Fashion Valley Mall, professionally appointed, with large windows facing the corridor, with a nameplate that read Veteran Support Services and underneath it, Major Elena Martinez, Coordinator. The desk had a small corkboard behind it, and on that corkboard, pinned beside a photograph of Marcus Webb and David Martinez in uniform, both of them smiling with the kind of ease that suggested they were finally standing in a room where they didn't have to hide anything, was a single dog tag on a broken chain. The tag that Marcus had given David. The tag that David had given back to her. The tag that had hidden beneath her scrubs while she absorbed every insult Donovan could fabricate, every threat he could weaponize, every institutional mechanism he could turn against her. Elena reached up and adjusted the tag slightly. The chain caught the light. David stopped by the desk after school in his ROTC uniform to bring her coffee. Marcus visited every Thursday with his service dog for lunch, and they talked about the future in ways that didn't require looking backward at what had already cost them so much. Across town, Richard Donovan worked the night security shift at Oak Creek Memorial Hospital's parking garage, monitoring empty spaces under fluorescent lights that hummed like they were apologizing for his presence. His calls didn't get returned. His LinkedIn messages disappeared into the void. The institutional hierarchy had moved on without him, indifferent to his fall, indifferent to his disappearance. Elena touched her left shoulder, still scarred, still aching on cold mornings, and smiled at a teenage volunteer in the program she had started, helping a young veteran in a wheelchair navigate the corridor. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. That was what she had learned, or maybe what she had always known but had finally been allowed to acknowledge in public, in daylight, without anyone telling her to be quiet about it. If you found yourself rooting for Elena, if you found yourself angry on her behalf, subscribe now for more stories about the quiet strength of people you might have underestimated. And comment below, what would you have done if you had witnessed what Richard Donovan did? Would you have stood beside Elena, or would you have stayed silent?